The following program contains views that are not those of WVTC, iNetworks Communications, their subsidiaries, affiliates, or financial supporters.
Welcome to Pastor Church in the Law. We live under our faith, but under the law. And so we have a whole lot to tell you about today. Have back with me our regulars, our anchors. We have Attorney Rodney Howard on my left, your right, and Attorney Aaron McLeod on my right, your left. So today, gentlemen, what we're going to talk about, sir, as he would call, I forgot, he's professor. He's professor.
He's professor. Well, hopefully we can discuss somewhat carefully and briefly abuse in the church. We have a few cases. One involves a church member who was sexually assaulted by a minister in a church. This case comes to us from the Supreme Court of Virginia. It's entitled A.H. versus the Church of God in Christ. And in that particular situation, you have a church minister assaulting a youth who was a member of the church during the youth activities. And the question is whether the church had assumed a duty to protect minors by implementing sexual misconduct policies and whether those policies had been breached, that duty had been breached. So we want to look at both child abuse reporting requirements and also look at the obligations and responsibilities of churches in these kinds of situations.
So you do know that every state has laws that govern how churches should be dealing with minors who attend their congregation, attend programs sponsored by the church. So when young people are in the church, may not be members of the church, do we have a duty to protect them from sexual abuse while they're on the premises or engaged in youth activities before we get into that case?
Well, certainly we have that situation where there is a duty in Illinois, especially the Illinois statutes, 325 Illinois statutes, starting at section 5, says that there is a duty to report sexual abuse. So that's first of all, even if the abuse occurs outside of the church, if the leadership of the church becomes informed that there's a possibility of physical, mental, or sexual abuse of minors, they have an obligation to report it.
Report it to whom?
Report it to the, several
let's just take
agencies.
Illinois. Who do we have to report to in Illinois?
Well, first of all, there's an obligation to make a police report.
So you got a police report, and who else?
In certain instances, the Department of Children and Family Services.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So suppose a child comes to the church and you see bruises and scars that are not normal from a child to say have just scraped a knee or something, but it's real bruises on the child's face, arms, and if it's some legs. Is there a duty to report potential abuse?
The reporting entity does not have to go into the details if there's a suspicion.
A mere suspicion.
That child abuse is occurring, a report is made and it gives the agency, either the police or the Department of Children and Family Services,
which we call DCFS.
DCFS,
in Illinois.
the opportunity to investigate, to determine whether or not child abuse is actually occurring.
Okay, so that relates to if a child comes in onto the premises into a program, there is a duty. If you think there's reasonable suspicion that there's been abuse, you have to report it. So
And
who has to report it?
well, any director or staff assistant, if it's a nursery or a daycare facility, ministers, especially because of their position of trust, are required to also report potential child abuse situations, and certainly persons who believe that ministers may have been involved are obligated to report child abuse instances if they believe that child abuse is occurring.
So now this case that you said, AH versus, I guess they kept the name of the child secret, so they used initials. That's why we're saying AH. I know that's not the child's name. In Virginia, the minor said that she was allegedly assaulted by a church minister during youth activities. And so the question is, do you think the church has a duty to report this to the appropriate officials? What do you think?
They do, without question. But I guess the larger issue is not just the reporting, but do they actually have the duty to protect, and how do you protect?
You don't think they have a duty?
They do.
Okay, what is the duty of the church if a child says to you as pastor, one of your ministers abused me?
Minimally report, but the duty begins before that.
So you think the church has a duty to protect all children?
I think the church has a duty to protect all children, but the protection comes within the system of how and the protocols that you have in place to ensure that.
So
the child
where
is
do these
protected.
protocols? Where are they supposed to be? Are they in the bylaws? Are they in rules of the church? Rules of the youth ministry? Because everybody says, "I got youth ministry, I got children's ministry." Do you have some rules?
There should be.
Where should they
the
be?
church leadership is obligated. They can be in a policy that is established by the church leadership. They can be in the bylaws if the bylaws address that kind of issue. But there should be something within the guidelines of the operations of the church that spell out specifically instances where one is a duty to protect children that are participating in church activities, and also the idea that the leadership of the church has a responsibility to ensure that the children are protected. And that doesn't mean the children have to be members of the church. If they participate in any activities sponsored by the church, it can be off-site. But if it's a church-sponsored activity, they still have an obligation to report instances of child abuse.
So does that duty include background checks for all persons dealing with children?
Well, you have to look at it from this perspective. In order to protect the children, you want to limit the exposure of children to potential harm by predators. And churches are notorious as a place where people have easy access to children, and pedophiles especially are prone to try and come to churches to have access to the children.
And they're nice people. Children generally like the pedophiles that may come to your church. So we say protect the children. We have to have some rules. You got to have rules for picking them up and dropping them off.
So I think the distinction should be made, though, I would contend, Professor, that there should be a simple exhortation in the bylaws that say it is the desire of our congregation to protect children. I don't think that the policy should be within the bylaws.
So you want a separate policy for children?
So within our denomination, it's called Safe Sanctuary.
Yes.
And so within that, there's a separate policy. And in addition to that, I don't think policies should be fleshed out in bylaws. They should be referenced. It should be a separate document that goes in depth about that
So
particular.
your bylaws should say we have a child protection policy,
Mhm.
and then you have a written policy. So the written policy should include, and this is where we forget, when you're transporting children, there has to be a policy. The bus driver, the van driver should not drop off children alone. There should always be a male and a female on that transport, so that the last child to get out is not a last child with the driver, because there could be allegations referencing the driver, and then there's no adult witness. The other thing is, what should the policies include to protect children?
A myriad of checks and balances, as we already said, background checks, but more specifically,
Background checks of the workers.
the workers. Yep.
But what do you expect? How do you know this child can go with X person that picks them up?
Well, you have to also have parental guidelines to make sure that you have consent from the parents and that the parents are aware of who they are giving their children to, who's going to be responsible while the child is in the church's custody, and who is going to return the child back to the parents.
So one of the things you got to have, it doesn't matter if the child's a member of your church, even if they're a member, there should be a parental consent form for every child participating in any programs within the church. You can make it broader, I guess, right?
Yeah.
For if your child participates in the youth program and give the time and date of those programs, they have to sign a parental consent. The consent should include any medical issues the children have. So that's another thing. You can't just drop the child off who has several conditions that the church needs to be aware of. So they shouldn't be playing sports. They have epileptic seizures. They have to take an EpiPen because they're allergic to certain things. That has to be in the information provided to the church so that they can be aware of the unique issues.
And certainly if they have food allergies,
Got to know that.
we have to know it specifically so that we can avoid instances where the children are being urged to violate those principles to see what will happen. Children do a lot of things that they shouldn't do, and we have to protect them from themselves sometimes.
So that means you have to know every child that's in a program sponsored by your church, allergies that child may have, certain conditions that they may have that you should be aware of so that you don't have them doing things that will cause them harm. Now, as it relates to sexual abuse, what should be in the policy?
One, the zero sum policy, a zero tolerance policy as far as inappropriate or sexual interactions with youth.
And so are you going to require your staff to go through training?
Must.
What kind of training?
Minimally, let me say it this way. The training should be comprehensive. Protecting the institution, you want to ensure that people go through the training and more specifically that they sign off. You don't want it to come back that, that there was training or that they did not go through the training, because then you're, opening yourself for the liability. And I've seen that within, trying to defend people in their ignorance of what they've done, that they weren't true.
We had a guy that had abused a children at the church. He went to jail. He was released from prison, came back to the church where he had abused the children. What's the position on that?
Well,
and he was a minister.
He was
I won't say the church.
He was an assistant minister, and he came back seeking restitution to his position as assistant minister in the church. And the question was, should the church, in an effort of forgiveness, say that he has paid his debt to society and we welcome him back into the church community? And at the same time, the people who he had abused were sitting in the balcony of the church at the time he came down the aisle to reconnect to the church.
Oh, that's a question. What does our faith require us to do? Yes, we have to forgive. The question is, do we forgive and believe that he has been restored to wholeness? And how do you do that when you have the children who were abused in the same congregation? Perhaps the recommendation is to send him somewhere else, because I don't think the people that he abused could be whole with him present.
You definitely need to send them somewhere else. And so we
want
a happy-go-lucky relationship with people as we serve God. But what we often undermine is the fact that these institutions are businesses, that they are corporations, they are operations that need to protect themselves from liability. And so if there are some infractions, it doesn't mean that God doesn't love you, that you cannot be redeemed by God, but it may not be in the best interest of the institution for you to come back and serve in that same position.
Because ministers have a position of authority, trust, and responsibility. So we have to be careful. Same thing with your youth directors, your children's ministry. I've seen some larger churches do this very well. There's a code to sign the child in, a code to sign the child out. So miscellaneous can't pick the child up without making sure that they are connected to that child.
Well, and you also have other instances. It's not just the ministers who are involved in this kind of situation as well. We haven't had a situation where one of the ushers developed an unhealthy interest in a particular child and followed the child to school, and his parents went and got a protective order so that he could not be within 100 feet of the child at any time. Now, because the church had 2 services, the pastor allowed him to only come to the morning service where the child and his parents were not coming, the early morning service, but he could not participate in church activities in any other time other than that, so that his right to exercise his religion as a part of the church was maintained, but the children and the parents were directed to only come to the regular morning service, so that they could maintain contact and continuity. At the same time, you had to also be obedient to the court's order. And so all of that had to come into play. And those are the kinds of issues that we don't talk about in our churches.
Well, we're going to have to start talking about them. You know, you just can't let children do what they want to do and people interact with children. One of the recommendations we had with children going to the bathroom, that is where pedophiles pray, in bathrooms. And I was at a very famous church and a lady said, do not let these people take your child to the bathroom. It never occurred to me. You know, you don't think church people are going to do stuff, but they do. And not all of them, but you don't need but one. And so you have to have a policy like they do in elementary school for children. You go as a group. It's not one child just wandering around by themselves with one person taking them. And then there's other things, abuse, not always sexual, but it's physical. Teachers in churches reprimanding children by hitting them. Your policy has to look at all of those things. Or harmful touching of children it's got to be prohibited in church as it is in schools.
And I think that the conversation, obviously, the policy is a part of a system. But I remember when I first came to Chicago and I was under your tutelage, you and I went to a training over at D. Darrell Griffith's church, and they were talking about systems.
Yeah, you got to have a system.
You know, this pastor was there. He's like, you know, nobody goes to lunch in groups of 2s and groups of 3s. And so when you have a culture and you implant the underlying purpose of the system in your culture, it alleviates problems like this.
So in this case, AH versus the Church of God in Christ in Virginia, what happened?
Well, the court first had to determine whether or not the church had a duty to protect the children, and it concluded that there was an absolute duty of the church to protect the children. And then the next question was, did in fact a abuse situation occur? The court sent the case back down to the trial court for further evidence as to whether or not there was an actual instance of child abuse.
And the other thing is you got to enforce the policy. You can't just have some paper that you don't ever enforce, you don't ever review. You have children, you have teens, which is a greater risk because they think they're grown. You have to have all of your leadership trained on how to deal with children and the approvals that are required, the checks and balances. because there are sometimes people think that they make up rules about how you talk to children, how you handle them, particularly with young men. So you have to have everybody understand the policy and how it's to be implemented. And then you have to monitor it.
The last issue in this case dealt with the idea that the church had, in fact, established some child protection policies, but they were not being enforced effectively. And so once you have these policies, you have to make sure that there's adequate monitoring and supervision to make sure that the policies are being effectively enforced.
We got another case, Conti versus Watchtower Bible Tract Society. Is that the Jehovah's Witness? Yeah,
Yes.
that's in California. Okay,
Now this
this is something that we have to know about.
in this particular case, the person was an adult who had been sexually abused by another member of the church who was not the minister. But the church had noticed that this sexual abuser had a history of sexual abuse, and they did not take action to inform the parishioners. And so this particular member, Candace Conti, sued the church and the denomination because they had prior knowledge and had not issued any warnings.
So do you think that the church has a duty to know the conduct of every member of the congregation and to tell the whole congregation that that person is a sexual predator? I know you want to know. I want to know too. But does the church have an obligation to make sure that they let you know that John Jones is a sexual predator? I don't know John Jones. I'm just using that John Doe.
Well, in this particular instance, the court found that the church did not have a duty to warn other members of the past misconduct of any of the other members. In other words, the church had no obligation to tell you about the past conduct, even if they knew it, of the other members. Now,
if he had been prosecuted and served time, would they have a duty?
that becomes another issue.
Yeah.
And also, as we see with priests and other ministers, if the hierarchy of the church has knowledge and still continues to assign that priest or pastor or minister to other churches and not let the other churches know, the whole denomination can be held liable.
Yeah, I think the priest thing is different than this is just a person.
But I think there's a difference between
Not in
putting
these.
it on blast versus saying, we know this, therefore we're not assigning you to this position.
We didn't have a position.
No, but in general, when we're talking about the episcopacy or assigning somebody to youth ministry or bringing them into the fold with an employment position or an appointment position, if you do the background checks, it doesn't come back right. There's a way to steer them in a different direction without blasting it out to the congregation.
And also, you can have a private conference with the individuals and let them know that they're being scrutinized. And so that can help protect from these instances occurring.
So you just got to make sure that if you do have knowledge, I wouldn't get up on Sunday morning and say, hey, John Doe, we know you're a predator and women, y'all beware. What you do want to make sure that you don't put them in any position where they have interaction with children, minors, or in situations, you don't put them over to women's ministry.
And I think what we downplay is the science behind the behavior. I never forget when I was being trained as a prosecutor, we had to go to state prison and we sat on a panel with offenders who were found guilty and prosecuted for sexual assault or sexual offenses. And one gentleman was very open about his illness, that, it was escalating over time, the things that he was doing to set up traps for people. And he had said that even in the midst of being in jail for several years, he had not fully healed from the psychosis or the mental illness that he was causing him to do the heinous crimes that he was committing.
So this is these are just some things you need to know about what happens in church. I know we all think that everybody in the room is saved and sanctified and set apart. They may be all of that, but there are some concerns that you must have, and put some policies in place and train your staff, everybody on the staff, musicians, because you have a youth ministry. You have to make sure that you have a youth choir. You have to, everybody that's over any of your children and youth ministries and children, youth, any part of that, they all have to have this training, and the policy must talk about that.
And your ushers should also be trained to look at the congregation and monitor themselves, because in many instances they're in a position to see things that other people may not pick up on.
And then you have to have a reporting mechanism, I suppose.
Yes.
What does that look like? You got 2 minutes.
Yeah. Normally it's a database in which you do the searches and you understand who's where. And in essence, there's a clearinghouse of folks who can work in certain sectors of the ministry, and then those who we direct to other sectors. And
incidents have to be documented. There should be an incident reporting process and format that you use, a report form that has to be filled out so that there's a documentation of it at the time the incident occurs.
And it's not personal. Investigate everything, all claims, all accusations.
Right.
Now, the way in which you go about doing it. What you do not want to do is go in front of a judge and it come out when you are defending the case that there was not an internal investigation when the allegations were made.
And you always, the whole thing about the biblical method of 2 or 3, you need 2 or 3 to go. Your last word, your last word.
Well, especially in instances of child abuse, pastors and church leaders have a fundamental responsibility to report, and when in doubt, they should lean towards reporting rather than not reporting.
Oh boy, I have a lot of reports going on. Right?
Yeah.
Your last word.
Systems make the world go better.
You keep reading the Bible till you meet us all at the face to face. You pray for us, we'll pray for you. This is church law. We live in our faith, but under the law. Remember that.
Go to your Apple or Google Play Store and download the WVTC Gospel Radio app today. You can also say, Alexa, play WVTC Radio Skills.
Would you like to play WVTC Radio Network?
Absolutely. Download it today.
Views made on the preceding program are not those of WVTC Radio, iNetworks Communications, or their financial supporters.
Winning victory through Christ, WVTC Allsip Chicago, and iNetworks Communications Station.